And then say, so welcome everyone, for those of you that just joined, and I know we've got a number of sort of new guests this week, so particularly welcome to you. It's our weekly call, which I'll sort of share some slides in a moment. You will have heard that we are recording the call, so do bear that in mind, that the sort of both the sound and indeed the chat are captured and may be shared. Well, the sound will be, the chat may be selectively as appropriate later on. But let me just briefly share my screen so you can see what the agenda is for the call this week. So hopefully you can all see that. Right, so topics we're going to cover this week. We're going to kick off by talking about the European Commission's High-Level Group for Internet Governance, or HLIG for short. I'm going to start by concentrating on the DNS4 EU project, which I'll explain a bit more about in a moment, before just touching on some of the other agenda items from the meeting which took place last Wednesday. Some of you will be aware I did invite the Commission team to join the call, but they're not on the call this week, so I'll be reprising their slides on DNSU, but DNS4 EU, but obviously I'm not part of the Commission, so I'm giving sort of, although you can see the bullet points, I'll give sort of my view as to some of the points covered. Potentially there are other people on this call that may well have been at the meeting last week, so if you were at the meeting, feel free to sort of share your take as well as we roll through that. And then in less detail, I just sort of summarize some of the other items from the meeting as appropriate. So that'd be selective highlights from some of the rest of the meeting, but not in so much detail. Having done that, we'll move the discussion on to some highlights from IETF 112 last week, which seems to have gone by in a flash, but we'll sort of just roll through some of the sort of various sort of points of interest that arose through the week, which may help people. Now all the recordings of all of the sessions are available online. It may sort of direct your interest to particular recordings if you weren't able to attend in person last week, or indeed if you were but you missed some of the many sessions. I think there were 114 in total. And then we go on to any other business. There's three things you'll see on the screen that I'm going to touch on: future agenda items, and then IETF positions, and also the RIPE DNS working group co-chair vacancy, and then anything else that anyone else wants to raise. Should give us plenty to cover this week. And as we run through, if anyone's got any questions, please use either the Zoom facility to raise your virtual hand, and or put anything in the chat, and I'll sort of pick up on that as we run through. So without further ado, let's start by talking about the DNS4 EU project. Clearly these are not the Commission's slides, in case you're wondering, although they do contain the same content as the Commission's slides in terms of the words. Just briefly by way of background, DNS4 EU is a proposal to sort of launch a new open resolver for use within the EU to augment various other options already in the marketplace. The slides will go on in a moment to talk about some of the advantages potentially that DNS for EU brings. So it's not a thing which currently exists, but it's something which the Commission would like to see sort of brought to the market shortly. The sort of context that they gave, and as I say, these are not my slides in the sense of setting up the bullet points are not mine, these are theirs, so bear that in mind if you have any questions. They sort of talked about the sort of consolidation in the marketplace generally, and highlighted the growing market share of the likes of Google and Cloudflare resolvers, and there's data from AppNet and others, which is useful to take into account if you're interested in exploring that in more detail offline, and happy to take questions on that if that's of interest. They also mentioned some outages over the last 12-15 months from some of the large resolvers. I know, for example, Cloudflare had an outage a few months ago now. They probably mentioned some other examples, but that's one that stuck to mind. Also, the fact that data protection is an issue, or can be, with some of the current resolvers, because they're operated by companies not headquartered within the EU and not covered, who are nevertheless covered by GDPR, but are also covered by, if they're US companies, for example, the US Cloud Act and FISA 702, which has implications for sort of data protection as it applies to personal data. And also the importance of sort of preventing, as it says, cyber attacks, viruses, malware, etc., and the fact that many of the threat feeds are very, let's say, US centric, and the benefits potentially of being able to develop threat feeds which are much more focused on the European market. So, in that, so with that context, so DNS for EU as a proposition has been developed as an alternative to the current resolvers. It's intended, amongst other things, to improve resilience, given some of those outages and other sort of issues around centralization and so on. It's meant to give a high quality and free service, importantly from the point of view of the Commission, that's based in the EU and complies with EU data protection rules, etc. And it gives improved protection from malware, etc. So that's the rationale for wanting DNS for EU. And what they're looking for is something which, from an infrastructure point of view, has got a substantial footprint within the EU, offers some paid premium services to augment the free service, potentially, for example, focus on some of the verticals that the Commission views as being important, such as health, finance, etc., and maybe also premium services based around things like additional filtering options, additional support, etc. It must be fully compliant with GDPR, give DNS-based filtering for countering malicious content, using both existing threat feeds, but also to develop its own, so based on the footprint of the service, support latest standards, including DOE, amongst others, and to offer wholesale options to interested parties, including ISPs and cloud service providers. And the intent is funding for it is proposed to come from the CEF2 budget envelope, specifically the European Cloud Federation Initiative, for those of you that are interested specifically in that sort of thing. In the presentation, I think for the first time, the Commission committed that potentially up to 50% of the initial infrastructure investment, and they included within that things like sort of threat feed investment, could come from the Commission, although I don't remember, I certainly didn't note down any maximum investment from the Commission. Well, there is a maximum available amount, as well as it being no more than 50%. The sort of process will start by the end of this calendar year, which is after all only, what, 6 weeks away, so starting any time now, basically. So it repeats the point about it needing to support the latest standards. Don't know why that was repeated, but it was on the slide again. And they're looking for consortia to come forward to bid to operate the service, not just necessarily drawn from the tech and telecom sectors, but potentially more broadly than that, to reflect some of the key industry verticals and others. And they're, I think, as part of the proposals, they're looking to see how the service would have long-term financial viability, given that the funding from the Commission will only be upfront funding for some of the capex and won't fund the future operating costs. So they clearly want to see how it would have sustainability in a financial sense over time. And I think that was pretty much everything that was covered in the presentation. I'll look in the chat in a moment to see if there are any questions. I can see Zaid, you've got your hand raised. Well, firstly, Zaid, do you want to jump in with your question? I'll look in the chat in a moment, but also anyone else that was on the call, feel free to also come on with your views as well. But Zaid, sorry.
So two quick questions, Andrew. One, will the slides be available? And two, in terms of the rationale behind this, wouldn't that in a way create another kind of centralized DNS resolving mechanism? If you know, if that's one of the key reasons why DNS for EU is, you know, being pitched, wouldn't that also create another? Or is there another? Is there a kind of underlying? Is this just an umbrella and there's an underlying structure which guarantees the distribution of it, and also so on and so forth? Yeah.
So taking those in order, well, these slides will absolutely be available after the call. The Commission, I'm sure, will share the, if you like, the official slides post-meeting, but they can take a few weeks after the meeting before they're put up on the website. But the content, in terms of the words from this component, is the same. But yeah, I'll share these immediately after the call, so these will be at your disposal. In terms of the if you like, the harder question, I suppose even if by definition DNS for EU is clearly a centralized service in one sense, it's adding to the marketplace versus you know, the various existing sort of cloud-based resolvers. So it is adding additional variety. But yeah, I think the expectation is that this will be delivered perhaps in a more distributed manner than some of the other existing cloud-based resolvers. But this is where we really would need someone from the Commission to maybe expand on their thinking somewhat. But yeah, that's my extrapolation. Without being in a position to speak for the Commission on this.
Thank you much.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay, does anyone else, I think there are a few of us on this call that were on the call last week, so anyone else want to jump in, feel free to do so. But Carsten, you've raised your hand.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much also for the short introduction and presentation about what's known about DNS for EU up to, well, these days. My question is whether there's any additional information available or suggestions even only, whether what's the problem statement behind it, as in is there anything else beyond, or existing services might fail every now and then, which they do, this, that, and the other. So I don't really understand yet where this actually comes from, in terms of like a proper problem statement, as in, is the DNS broken in Europe or worldwide, even as resolver-wise? And the other part is, does anybody within the call here would have any kind of clue whether this would become compulsory to use in the end, and whether the service itself is meant to be, say, managed, to put it in a friendly, in friendly words, not to call it censored, as in what is how should I phrase this? Is the resolution really based on the DNS, or is the resolution essentially only based on, say, the better part of the DNS, which has been sort of assessed by or curated by some entity? So essentially these three things, whether it's what's the problem statement, whether it's compulsory eventually to use it, at least for European Union citizens, and whether it's like a full DNS as it stands on any given point in time, or whether it's sort of like a curated DNS. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll give a take on that. So in terms of background, there were some earlier statements, I think early this calendar year, from the Commission, which what I'll do, Carsten, rather than trying to remember them imperfectly now, post-call, when I send out the links to the recording, I'll see if I can find links to some of the previous statements, which will give a little bit more rationale, probably not a lot, but you at least then have, I think, the totality of what's been said publicly that I'm aware of. So that may help to give a bit more on the thinking. But I think a lot of it is around sort of concerns about centralization, so therefore wanting resilience, but also I think under the sort of banner of digital sovereignty, also concerns about ever increasing reliance on sort of core parts of the internet infrastructure located outside of the boundaries of the European Union, and wanting to have some alternatives which are sort of located closer to home. But let me see what I can sort of pull out, if you like, in terms of official statements as well, to augment that. Nothing whatsoever has been said about compulsion to use, so it's only ever been talked about in the context of adding an additional option. What might happen in the future, who knows? I think none of us on this call would be in a position to say what the future looks like, but that's not even been hinted at in anything that I've seen, and I suspect will be quite problematic amongst the member states to actually get buy-in to that. But that's not even been sort of discussed in any forum that I'm aware of. On your question, which I will reinterpret as, is this going to be censored in any way, which isn't quite what you said, but I think is perhaps what you were driving towards. I think they're absolutely wanting to do content filtering based around malicious content, because of the points that I sort of covered on here around threat feeds, etc. So I think that's absolutely part of this, is to provide better threat protection. Beyond that, then we get into questions about adherence with the rules of individual member states, principally. And I think that detail needs to be worked through in the various proposals that come from consortia, as to how they'll comply with national rules, which, depending on what member state you're thinking of, some have quite clear rules about the requirements to limit access to particular content types, but equally other member states have rules that will absolutely prohibit limiting access to content in that way. So I suspect it will need to support different requirements in different member states. So it will depend on where the query is originating from. But that's, I think, a detail that will need to come from would-be operators as to what they believe is technically feasible to offer. And that's the joys of different member states having completely contradictory national legislation in this area. And I think there's very little which is EU-wide, other than possibly, I think I'm right in saying it's probably illegal to provide access to child sexual abuse material. I think that might be legal across all the member states, but that's probably about it. I'm not aware of anything else, but there are others on this call that are probably better qualified than me to comment on what consistency between member states might be.
Thank you, Andrew.
You're welcome. Okay, let me just look in the chat to see. Yeah, I think, yeah, I agree with the comment from Alexandra that the Commission so far has not been particularly prescriptive as to how to deliver this. So that will be down to the consortia on what they provide. Just putting out, yeah, and as we just discussed, Ray, yeah, I'll share. I think there are a couple of other things which have been published previously, which I'll share after this call. And I can see Mark has put at least one of them, maybe more in the chat. So thank you to that, Mark. Is anyone else that was at the meeting last week, anything substantive that you think I missed?
This is John.
Adding? Yeah, John.
This is John Andrews. I was in the meeting. I think to the earlier question of a problem statement, I agree that there's not a well-defined problem statement yet. But I will say that from a contextual perspective, the DNS for EU discussion followed right after some introductory words, which were much more broadly descriptive of how the EU is looking to regain or at least guarantee sovereignty in certain ways. They talked about the CHIPS initiative, the EU CHIPS initiative, which is moving semiconductor manufacturing back into Europe. They talked about the Digital Compass and Digital Decade programs, which again have components which are trying to bring infrastructure into Europe, and then also kind of unrelated, but I suppose related in some ways, looking at what the initiative for Global Gateway, which is trying to, I guess, then export some of these capabilities to locations, and they specifically announced or specifically mentioned the Global South as destination. So there was some context about sovereign capabilities as being, I think, one of the primary motivators.
Yeah.
But again, that's all reading between the lines. And I will also say that there was a very strongly implied comment about countering the Digital Compass and Digital Decade programs and the initiative for Global Gateway, countering what they called and was described as a splinter net, trying to avoid those conditions. And I think reading in between the lines again, that's looking at the Belt and Road initiatives by China, but that's just my interpretation of it.
Yeah, that's very kind, and I will come on to some of that other content momentarily. But yeah, you're right. I think you're just spot on, John. Those all seem to set the tone. Again, actually, I can see more hands raised. Let me just drop the screen sharing for a moment because it makes it easier for me to stop to spot who's raised hands. Vittorio, did you want to come in?
No, I just wanted to, I had a brief comment given the observations that were in the chat, and I think it's useful to provide a little context. So I think this was born out of the rush to digital sovereignty that was very pressing when the last commission was formed, let's say in 2019, generally speaking. And so I think this comes from a very high level, very political pressure towards making the European internet completely autonomous and able to survive even in the absurd situation in which the entire rest of the world becomes hostile to Europe and stops their services, and so all the foreign services go abroad and stop working. And I think in terms of national security, it's still something that makes sense. So then, I mean, I guess that the politicians knew they wanted this, but they didn't really know what they wanted. And it's normal for very high level political people. So now the commission has been working throughout the year to try to put some content into this. And the idea is basically just to have yet another public resolver that can be used if all the other public resolvers should, for some reason, stop working or become inaccessible from Europe. In the European legal framework, it's basically impossible to think that a single specific resolver can be made compulsory so that everyone has to use it. I don't see this ever happening. What could reasonably happen is that the European Union can set up rules that apply to all resolvers that offer services in Europe, like the GDPR and so. But I don't see this going beyond that. I think that honestly, I mean, having some experience in completely other fields of EU-founded projects and so on, this is likely to generate something that could even not become widely used. So, I mean, it's important for Europe to have it for political reasons. If it's used or not, it's not too much of a problem. Then, of course, we hope that something useful comes out of this. But even if it should not become widely used, it will still be something that's worth the investment in political terms seen from Brussels.
Yeah, I think fair comment. Yeah, whether it's used or not, I guess, who knows at this stage. It probably rather depends who actually is behind the winning consortium ultimately. Mark, apart from posting those very helpful links in the chat, did you want to come in with some other comments?
Oh, yeah, just one additional bit of context. I mean, clearly there is a political element of this, digital sovereignty, but I think there's a logical element of it as well. The new NIS directive, the NIS2 directive, declares that the DNS is critical infrastructure. NIS1 made that sort of optional. Any member state could define their own critical infrastructure, but NIS2 says, well, across the union, DNS is going to be considered critical infrastructure. And so if you do declare that to be critical infrastructure, then for reasons of sovereignty and resilience, there ought to be some sort of a EU backup. And so I think that perhaps that flows from that logic.
Yeah, that's fair. Certainly logical if it's going to be defined as critical national infrastructure. Okay, all right. Well, if no one else has got any other sort of questions or points, then as I say, I'll absolutely share these slides plus some more, which we haven't got onto yet. Plus, I'll add some of the links that are already in the chat and any others with any background. And then the commission team behind this have got a sort of a standing invite to join the call. So if they do come back to me to say they're happy to join a future call, then obviously I'll let people know, and then there might be a chance to ask some additional questions of them. The only other point to make is if this is all going to start formally in the next few weeks, then no doubt there'll be a formal announcement to sort of push that out, which again I'll add to our sort of weekly headlines as soon as that appears, and no doubt we'll cover it on the call as that happens. Okay. Right, well, let's, in that case, go back to the rest of the HLIG meeting, of which DNS for EU was the just one part. So I go back to the screen share and scroll through the slides. So the full agenda for the meeting. There's some introductory comments which John's already alluded to, which I will briefly summarize in a moment prior to about DNS for EU. Then some updates on a new study on adoption of internet standards and how to improve that, and also on a DNS abuse study. Then an excellent presentation, if I may say so, which Vittorio gave, summarising what the sort of latest state of play is with DOE and other related developments, including private relay, which did prompt some comments from the Commission, which we'll maybe come on to, and then updates from ICANN and also the IGF. So again, I'll just briefly roll through some of those. From the top, in the order they are on the agenda, there were references to the planned European Cyber Resilience Act and the CHIPS Act, which sort of John referenced already. So that sort of very much seems to be consistent with the whole sort of digital sovereignty initiative. They sort of referenced it to Digital Compass and sort of very much a vision for developments through to 2030, and having a series of European digital principles consistent with European values and legislation. A public consultation on that, by the way, closed closed in September, and there's a target to adopt the proposals by the end of this calendar year, which might be a bit ambitious because there's not a lot of time left now. But again, if I have time to look them up before I send out the link to the recording, I'll put a link to that public consultation as well, if that's of interest to people. They also mentioned briefly that the EU, so the .eu registry has been re-awarded to URID, who are the current provider. Probably not a lot else to mention on that. And then, yeah, again, as John said, a very brief sort of mention of the Global Gateway Initiative, which sounded to me like the sort of EU's equivalent of the sort of Chinese Belt and Road project. So targeted about improving connectivity in sort of particularly the Indo-Pacific and Africa, and sort of discussions about sort of the importance of open and free governance around that. But yeah, that very much sounded like it was a Belt and Road competitor, at least that's how it came across on the call. And then after the DNS for EU update, Rudiger Martin of the Commission, along with Ignacio Sanchez of JRC, gave an update on the study on the adoption of internet standards, where they're very keen to accelerate the take-up of standards. Surprisingly, at least to me, most of the emphasis on the call was about IPv6, with passing reference to the potentially including DNSSEC and routing. And this was all about trying to enhance trust and security of the internet. I think some agreement about the importance of considering the increased centralization risk and the negative implications that has on resilience. And also, in response to a question I raised, agreement from the Commission that it'd be good to have the member states more involved in internet standards, including in things like the IETF and other such standards development organizations. Jumping forward, a study on DNS abuse is due to report next month, so December 2021. So I think the work has clearly been pretty much done now. They're now writing the report on that with a view to guide policy development and future actions to presumably deal with DNS abuse, although I confess I've not been following that closely myself. Then sort of Vittorio gave a marvelous presentation on encrypted DNS, particularly DOE, but also sort of touched on private relay, which prompted some comments that I think Commission is taking an interest in private relay and some of the associated antitrust issues potentially arising from that. So that, well, it was quite an interesting sort of side discussion. After which some of the ICANN team came on to talk about WHOIS and EPDP, which is really hard to say. And again, but not in a huge amount of detail, the recent ICANN 72 event, the key themes of which, if you didn't attend that, were around DNS abuse, amongst other things, and also plans for ICANN 73 in March and ICANN 74 in June of next year. And then finally, we went on to this update on IGF 2021, which takes place first week of December. It's going to be a hybrid event taking place in person in Poland, but I think they've got about 3,500 people, or they did last week, registered, and they're expecting roughly 50% in person, roughly 50% attending remotely. And there's going to be a sort of an interesting test of how to run a hybrid event. So there's going to be a single mic queue, for example, in the different workshops, and various other sort of innovations. So it's going to be interesting to see how that works in practice. And again, I know a number of us on this call will either be there in Katowice in person or attending remotely, so we can compare notes afterwards to see how that went. And also there was a reference, so final comment from me, about the IGF leadership panel and nominations for which close on the 29th of November. So a couple of weeks to get nominations in if you're interested in that. And I'll share a link on that with the call recording, etc., if that is of interest to anyone. So if I stop sharing, it's a bit tedious looking at that slide. I can see a couple of people have raised their hands. So Carsten, did you want to come in first on that? You're on mute currently, Carsten.
Yeah. Just seeing this. Thank you. In terms of IGF attendance during the high-level call, has there been any notion about the number / interest / intentions / whatever you want to call it of in particular parliamentarians from Europe, but also from other areas and continents on this planet? Because for personal reasons, I've been involved in the last two IGFs in bringing as many parliamentarians to the IGF as possible. As I haven't heard yet of any, say, ongoing project in terms of like doing an outreach as we've done throughout the last two times. I'm still obviously interested in any progress that has been made in, say, the past weeks or month in regard to outreaching to parliamentarians or politicians in general. Thank you.
So I'll confess I didn't listen too closely, but there is a parliamentarians track this time round, same as previously, and so I didn't listen so closely to the discussion on this bit, but certainly they did talk about the outreach program and the importance of getting parliamentarians either in person or indeed remotely. I can't remember if they gave any numbers, if I'm honest. If anyone else attended, please put a comment in the chat or sort of raise your hand and come in. But it certainly sounded to me as if it remained a focus. And I know certainly, gosh, 2 years ago now, roughly, in Berlin, there seemed to be a fantastic number of parliamentarians from all over the world in Berlin, which was very good. Made some of the workshops very interesting, actually getting different perspectives from all parts. So I hope that will be the same this time. But so it sounded like it would be. But as I say, if anyone picked up any specific points from the conversation, please sort of join the queue or put in the chat to add to my poor recollection from the call. All a bit of a blur last week, to be honest, Carsten, with IETF running every afternoon as well. So, yeah, I think there are going to be some there, but let's see if anyone else noted if any stats were given.
Excellent, Andrew. Thank you.
You're welcome. Mark.
Yeah, just a quick question regarding ICANN's presentation on who is in the ePDP. How did they position the ending of the ePDP?
Honest answer, I can't remember. Does anyone else on the call who was on the HLIG call was possibly paying better attention than I was to that part of the discussion? Anyone remember any specifics on that? Because it's not something which I'm as familiar with, to be fair.
Yeah, I'm just curious about how they're positioning the priority of an automated system to make registration contact data available. The impression I'm getting right now is that they're deprioritizing it as quickly as possible. I was just wondering if they had mentioned that at all.
I think there was some reference that there's a view that GDPR was being used, this is my phrasing, not what was said on the call, as an excuse to block a lot of data, perhaps unnecessarily, I think was my interpretation of what was said. It didn't require anything like as much to be blocked as some people were suggesting. But does anyone else pick up anything more specific than that? Because as I say, it's not an area that I'm as familiar with, so I didn't pick up so much.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot. I was just wondering what they might have said in this forum.
I'll check my notes properly afterwards, Mark, and see if I can give you anything more useful
Thanks.
than that. And if anyone else thinks of anything, please post it in the chat. Okay, any other points arising on that? Can't see anything else in the chat directly, so I'll take it not. So let
Andrew, can I ask
of course, Jerry.
just a quick question, and I'm sorry if you already covered this, but by any chance in the links that you will undoubtedly share with us later, will you be able to share like links for either joining the next call or whenever that's planned, or like to get involved or anything like this?
By next call, do you mean HLIG call?
Yes.
They tend to run every 3 to 4 months. So what I'll do, and it probably won't be till about a month before the call, that the agenda will come out and an invitation for people to register. So I will certainly, when that information becomes available from the Commission, I'll put that in the sort of weekly headlines and so on, and probably mention it on this call as well. So I'll share it when it's available, but as I say, normally it's about a month or so before the meeting they confirm the date of the meeting, and then put the actual agenda out. I think it's about 2 weeks before the meeting, and then you have to register if you want to join the meeting either in person or remotely.
Got it. All right, lovely. Well, thank you so much, Andrew. That'll be super helpful.
Surely. Okay, let's in that case just move on and quickly talk about the highlights of IETF last week. We may need to do this over 2 calls in order to do it justice. So let me go back to screen sharing again. So I'm hoping you can all see that.
Yeah, you can see it.
So was that a question?
We can see it.
You can't see it. Was that?
We see your screen.
You can. Okay.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Right. So I've put up these are the slides that we went through the week before IETF, which I'm sort of using just to structure the discussion. First thing I'll say, those of you that attended IETF, or indeed even if you didn't, I've put the link at the top of this slide is a link to the survey. So I know the Secretariat are keen to get people's views on IETF 112, or indeed views if you didn't attend, trying to, I think, capture reasons why not, where possible. So if you did attend, you would have got an email with a request to take part in the survey. But either way, please take part, because I know they've gathered the data and do make use of it, and it does make a difference to what happens. Anyway, on the meeting itself, I'm just going to go through and pull out a few of the workshops. I think in total 114, and we're not going to go through all of those because it will take far too long. The ones which I think, if you didn't attend, well worth catching up on, certainly the Oblivious HTTP Application Intermediation, or OHI working group. The first working group proper took place on Monday of last week, and I think there was a fairly vigorous discussion about the importance of things like discovery of the ingress and egress proxies, and whether that would or would not be beneficial, and also the importance of trying to prohibit, at least in band, the collusion between the proxies if Oblivious as a technique is to give any meaningful privacy benefits. And that certainly was occupied a lot of the chat time, as well as some of the mic time during the working group. And I'm going to roll through these, by the way, so if anyone's got any points to make as we roll through them, please either raise your hand or pop something in the chat as I sort of talk, but I'll try and give you the edited highlights. We had, I think, a very good ADD working group call immediately after OHI on Monday, with updates on the sort of DDR and DNR, DDR and legacy forwarders, split horizon. I know Dan is on the call, and some of the other authors as well. So Neil and others. So I think we covered many of the issues, and I think a few of us mentioned the importance of dealing with the world as it is, and providing solutions that benefit current end users, rather than trying to sort of pontificate on what's wrong with the world as it is. So that certainly sort of came across, I think, in some of the chat, but it was overall a very positive call, working group session. And I know we got the both co-chairs on, who may or may not want to comment, either by raising hands or putting something in the chat. And simultaneously to that happening, had the general area dispatch working group, which talked about things like term limits for people in various roles within the IETF, be they area directors, members of the ISG, IAB, etc., etc. The importance of providing effective antitrust guidelines, and a number of other issues like that. So if you like, for the more sort of general admin stuff, you might find it of interest to catch up with the Gen Dispatch recording and conversation. Sort of rolling through some of the other ones to look out for. There was an interesting presentation in MapG on a DNS exploit, so worth looking at that if that's of interest to you. An update on ECH interop testing in the TLS working group. And a very interesting presentation, which I'm going to just pause, mention briefly for a moment, the IETF open meeting on server-side content filtering evasion, and a technique that's been developed by the University of Maryland, where servers can actually identify and then evade content filtering, which they were looking at in the context of authoritarian regimes, but does, of course, well, certainly in my view, have rather unhelpful implications for things like malware as well. So, and you'll see, I'll come on to in a moment, but the author of that presentation and paper is going to join this call in a couple of weeks' time to talk about that some more. But I think it's very well worth your while looking at that in the meantime. It's a very interesting call. So jumping down through the back end of Wednesday, the only BOF session in IETF last week was the Privacy Respecting Incorporation of Values, or PREV, working group, well, sorry, BOF session, which had a number of use cases presented from different companies to sort of bring to life the relevance of that. And I suspect we'll move forward to be chartered as a working group, although clearly that will be discussed, I presume, by the ISG before that actually happens. On the others, the recursive to authoritative DNS with unauthenticated encryption came up again, and Paul and Paul Hoffman, Peter Van Dyke, persevering with their paper, which has gone through a number of iterations, and it sort of felt like that was moving forward now, which is good. Although there's some sort of new papers also were discussed in the meeting as well. There's an IB open meeting which included some discussion about network quality sort of measurement techniques. So moving beyond just sort of connection speed for broadband, for example, to other more meaningful measures. So for those of you that are in that space, working for ISPs, etc., that's probably worth a look. PEARG, definitely worth watching. Some stuff around sort of, privacy improvements for DNS resolution with confidential computing, which provoked an interesting discussion whether it was actually meaningful or not, and whether it is perhaps more in the more theoretical than actually practical to move forward on. And then probably one of the more lively discussions in the latter part of the week in DNSOP was the structured data for DNS access denied error page presentation with Dan sort of dealing with quite a few points coming from others. I think differences of view whether this is a good thing, or is the IETF being seen to endorse censorship, which I think is a strange take on it, but nevertheless that sort of came up. So it's certainly a lively debate, and it's worth sort of catching the recording if you didn't, just to sort of get that. But also perhaps a less lively debate, but equally useful. Ulrich gave an update on the DNSSEC automation paper even, which seemed a lot less controversial and seemed well received. And then final one I mentioned was the SHMU, or Stay Home Meet Only Online, or which might be renamed Occasionally Online, working group, which talked about, amongst other things, hybrid meetings, time slots for online meetings, etc. So quite a wide-ranging discussion about how best to approach whether it's online or hybrid. And I suspect, because it's going to be recharted, the focus of that working group will increasingly be more on hybrid, which makes sense given IETF 113 looks like it's going to be a sort of mixed in-person and remote meeting. And that's a very quick run through. Does anyone else that attended any of those want to say anything that you think I've missed, particular note from last week? I'll stop sharing again momentarily. feel free to jump in, anyone. So I know quite a few people on this call did attend.
Well, if I can add, last week at the ADD meeting, I was checking with the chairs on what's the current position regarding OHI. Since at previous ADD meetings, my understanding was that we could postpone working on ODO depending on the development of Oblivious HTTP. So I just wanted to mention here that I will be bringing this conversation to the mailing list this week. So then for people who are also interested in that topic, then to please join that conversation. And I had something else, but I forgot. So thanks.
I joined your working group as well, by the way, Joey.
Sorry?
I say, because you're now co-chair, I think, aren't you, of one of the working groups, or am I misremembering that?
I think you're misremembering. I was working for the Emodir Directorate, but I recently stepped down for different reasons. I'm not sure if you're remembering something different, though.
I'm thinking of that. You're absolutely right. So thank you for correcting that. So,
All right.
It's just a bit of a blur still.
Well, for Deprive, I am the co-author of one of the new drafts there. This one is on opportunistic probing for encrypted connections for the DNS in the recursive to authoritative leg. So we got a lot of feedback and a very good conversation at Deprive last week. But then I guess I can also take advantage of this call and invite people to get involved in that other discussion as well.
Surely, and by all means, put a link in the chat if you wish to encourage that, Joey. Okay, anything from anyone else from that? I can see no hands raised, so I'll take it as not. Well, conscious of the time, then let me just share. Oh, sorry, Glenn, do come in.
Hey, so Glenn here, one of the co-chairs of ADD. I think on the ODO stuff, one of the questions we're going to have to deal with is that the right fit into the ADD working group? You know, DO doesn't currently really have a developing working group that's working on the DO specification itself. We're working on discovery of DO and resolvers. I think it's ultimately going to be a question we have to kick up to the area directors and other parties to say, well, where do you want this work done? I don't think we're currently chartered for it. Well, I know we're not currently chartered for it. The tricky bit is nobody else is technically either. So I don't know where that ends up. Yeah,
because as I recall, ODO was earmarked to be experimental, not to go forward as a standard. But you're right, because the DO working group was closed, so there's no home for a continuing discussion anywhere, which is
right. Yeah, so it's sort of there's a bit of tennis being played here with the ball bouncing around from various parts of the court, and it doesn't have a home at the moment. So,
Glenn, then is it still helpful if I bring it up in the mailing list, or will this be for the chairs to discuss with the ADs?
Well, I mean, technically the chairs are limited in the context of ADD. We're limited really to focusing on what the ADD charter currently lets us work on. So it's not really a chair decision to take on that additional thing. You know, historically, what you'd have to do is you'd have to go back and you know, talk to the ISG and about rechartering and expanding the ADD scope. So I mean, you can post it there. The other place to post it might be you know, either DNS ops or Depriv, because again, there's no clear home at the moment. We're just not really chartered to work on that. I'm not trying to diminish the topic. It's a good topic. We're just not chartered to work on it.
Right. I think it's useful to bring up in the sense of, you know, identifying it as something that needs attention. And so I would certainly not discourage you from bringing it up on the list. You know, that's how you find like-minded people for being able to work on things. So.
Yeah.
All right. Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it might be a case of bringing up all three lists and see where the natural gravity sort of takes it.
Yeah, I guess my first question would be, like, my understanding is that Oblivious HTTP in its current form is not really useful for what we wanted at ADD regarding ODO anymore. Am I right?
I'd have to think through that. Sorry, I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, like which aspect of that are you identifying as?
All right. My understanding from a previous meeting was that even though what we needed to use for preserving the source, but mostly the source IP addresses with DOE, it was to use ODO for that, yeah? But then it came up during those meetings that, yeah, ODO would be good for that, but OHTTP was already under development, so then that we would wait to see how OHTTP would proceed, to see if OHTTP would still be useful or if we needed to continue development of ODO. Maybe I'm misremembering something.
I sort of remember some of that conversation and how it intersected with ADD, and it was related to people pointing out during the discussion that an important part of that being successful, if you had ODO, would be how you would do the discovery and the binding of the client to a ODO server or resolver. However, while we pointed that out, that in fact is a discovery thing, we also pointed out, as I recall, that ADD really doesn't have that in its charter either as one of its goals. And so it sort of, again, like a tennis match, got bounced back to the bigger task of where does this ODO and OHTTP really need to sit? And I mean, right now, I mean, I hate to take on my tennis racket and hit it again to somebody else for the analogy, but the people that really need to talk about that, I also think, are the area directors. So it'd be like Warren Kumari and Eric Vinky to sort of talk about, well, where do they think from an IESG standpoint that work really should fit? Because I don't know. I don't get paid the big bucks to be in the ISG. I'm just a lowly working group chair.
Right, and I think again the point though is, you know, as a potential area that needs further clarification, while you could bring it to the ADs in you know, private message or so, bringing it up on the list I think is still a good idea for visibility, for, you know, here's something that does need further discussion and resolution. So
yeah,
All right.
so maybe you put on the list and you make sure you CC and Eric and Warren so that they get
Right.
direct visibility.
right.
All right, that sounds good. Thank you, Bob.
Okay. All right, thank you. That I think it was a useful discussion. I'm just going to wrap up because I'm conscious we are a little over, so apologies for that. But just very briefly under AOB, a couple of quick points. Some future agenda items. We're going to have, I think, a fascinating presentation from Peter on the many varied uses of DNS, which he sort of talked about in outline previously. So we've got that scheduled in for the 29th. And then the paper that I touched on earlier, server-side evasion of filtering. Kevin Bock is going to, from the University of Maryland, is going to come on the call to talk about that some more on the 6th of December. And then on the 13th, that'll be the week after, or the Monday after IGF 2021, we'll pull out some of the highlights from that week. And I'm still trying to get confirmation from both Cloudflare on talking about their sort of recent update on ECH, and also Google on both supporting Android 13. So as and when I get confirmation from either of them, we'll put them both on the agenda as well. And then a couple of other sort of admin points briefly. If you have any views on any of the nominees for IETF positions, please give feedback through the Nomcom site. I've got a link on the slide there for that. And dare I say it, in particular, if you've got views on the LLC board nominees, that's myself, Bob Hinden, Bron and Jason, please put comments on those. And then in a similar vein, the RIPE DNS working group has got a vacancy for co-chair, and both Brett and Moritz have put themselves forward. So if you have any thoughts on that, please sort of post your views to the RIPE, so the DNS working group mailing list. I put the email address there, and you can see their original nominations on the mailing list. I put the link for that as well. And that's a very rapid through in any of that. So, but in the interest of time, I will talk about that some more. So, any final comments from anyone before we wrap up the call this week? Let me get rid of sharing again. See if anyone's got anything you want to add. Not seeing anything in the chat. Seeing no hands raised. So, well, hopefully that was useful. And I'll sort of take some of the links from the chat and a few other bits and pieces and put those out with the call recording probably some point tomorrow morning. So, have a fantastic week, everyone. Thanks for your time. Sorry you ran over, but hopefully that was all worthwhile for you. Speak to you again same time next week. Thanks all.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.